Christina, just talking about before the president started talking about what's taking place in Texas, you know, he was talking to this Munich Security Conference, and I think one of the things that sort of stood out to me was that was very different from the previous administration was a very clear criticism of Russia.
A very clear criticism of Russia, talks about Russian hacking, talks about Russian behavior, but it wasn't in a very hyper way, right? It was a very calm, measured, we're not going to allow this, you know, because a lot of these G7 members, you know, he talked about NATO, he talked about the alliance between the US and Europe, and he said, you know, this is very important, we're still here. He also said, you know, listen, that Article 5 is the mutual compact where if one of us is attacked, all of us is attacked, and everybody has to go to their defense. He said that's basically sacrosanct. You know, that we stand by that. Basically, we are here for you. We are not abandoning you. He even said, I know it's been a rough couple years, hint, hint, but this alliance is stronger than ever. And to put money where his mouth is, he said, we are reevaluating whether we're going to withdraw all those troops from Germany, which is something Europe was very against because obviously it benefits their security, especially if there's an aggressive Russia, to have a large U.S. troop presence in Germany. President Trump was saying he was going to rotate those troops out and put them other places. He wasn't a huge fan of Chancellor Angela Merkel. President Biden also made a point to say our great friends Germany will be speaking after us. So it's damage control, but it's also reassurance that America, as he says, is back and is still here to support its friends if needed, and if needed to protect them against Russia.
So, Ed, as you know, the Biden administration has signaled it's ready to join talks with Iran on a nuclear program. You know, what I'm curious about, and this is his first sort of big international conference, if we define the Trump administration and the Trump doctrine as America first, it'll be interesting to see going forward what the Biden doctrine is. In other words, it seems right now that all we're seeing, the moves that we're seeing from President Biden, is a dismantling of the Trump administration's approach to whether it's international geopolitical situations or at home. So what do you think how do you think it's shaping up, I guess, is the question with regards to the Biden doctrine?
He certainly, yeah, they're very sensitive about doctrine talk around here. They're not willing to go there yet. But you're right that in many ways, both domestically and on foreign policy, they've been sort of putting things back together the way they believe they should be. And in this regard, putting us back in the Paris Climate Accord, re-engaging Iran through the Europeans is certainly a return to the way it was during the Obama era. And those are things that he endorses. Two other things, though. One, the way I think we saw this week that they have handled Israel and Saudi Arabia, far different as well from the way the Trump administration has. He finally had a phone conversation with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, and then through the defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, there was a conversation with the Saudi crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. There were many who thought that the president would call that Saudi leader, but he said, no, I'm actually at a counterpart level with his father. That is a recalibration of a key relationship as well. The one aspect of foreign policy that he hasn't really weighed in, at least publicly yet on, and I know Christina will agree with me on this one, that is probably the most sensitive because there may actually be some real agreement between the current and former president, is Afghanistan. You heard him mention it there and gloss over it and move on quickly. There's an ongoing debate about whether to continue the troop withdrawal, to ask for an extension of talks with the Taliban that is ongoing, and try to sustain something because there's concern that if you pull out too many U.S. forces, the Taliban could, take over the country again. You could, wipe out 20 years of military intervention in that country, and he doesn't want to be the guy that's held responsible for that. So you're right. We haven't really seen entirely yet what the Biden doctrine would be, but it's certainly re-engaging the world, making climate change a bigger priority, and the fact that he attended this European conference virtually first is also a signal of how important he understands the European relationship with the United States to be. As I said earlier this morning, I think to Anne-Marie, the Munich Security Conference is essentially a Coachella for diplomats. He was there as a junkie for years, as a senator and as a vice president. That's how he met a lot of the people that are now at his level as world leaders when they were foreign ministers or other officials in their governments. And so for him to go and speak to this group virtually is a real nod to them, because he and many other senators through the years have attended this conference as a way to get to know the world.
Christina, let me ask you about another country that the U.S. sort of has a little bit of a sort of frenemy relationship with. The president spoke about the economic and national security challenges posed by China. What more can you tell us about what the Biden administration's goals are when it comes to the relationship with China?
Well, going back to Ed's point, there are a couple places where there's not a whole lot of disagreement with the previous administration. The Biden administration and Secretary of State Antony Blinken have said many of the same things about China. They've criticized the way they do business. As you heard, President Biden talked about, their unfair practices with companies and how there needs to be more transparency, and companies in Europe and America have to follow these rules. Companies that operate in China should have to follow them too. The difference isn't so much what they're saying it, but how they're saying it. They're trying to be a little more diplomatic about it. It's not quite as loud and as brash. But going back to the way they're approaching foreign policy, the last administration was a bit announce first and then get all your ducks in a row after. And this administration has been very diligent, and they said they were going to, and so far they have, especially with things like Iran, getting the Europeans on board first, about getting allies, getting everybody, getting Congress, getting people informed first before they announce something. Even yesterday announcing that the U.S. is willing to go to talks if someone were to invite them to talks with Iran. They didn't do it at a Secretary of State level, right? They did it at the envoy announced it, and they did it while Secretary Blinken was tweeting about other issues. And when asked by our PBS colleague why the low-key rollout, they said because we haven't done anything yet. We haven't gotten back into the agreement. We haven't gotten to the agreement. We haven't gotten to the table yet. We're announcing that we're willing to possibly go to the table, and we want to be realistic about what that means. And that's just a fundamentally different approach from the last administration, especially when it came to things with Iran, which Secretary Pompeo almost always announced any sanctions, any action, anything at all himself, because it was part of his maximum pressure campaign.
So let's play back a little bit of what the president had to say.
The United States is making a $2 billion pledge to COVAX with the promise of an additional $2 billion to urge others to step up as well. Yet even as we fight to get out of the teeth of this pandemic, the resurgence of Ebola in Africa is a stark reminder that we must simultaneously work to finally finance health security, strengthen global health systems, and create early warning systems to prevent, detect, and respond to future biological threats, because they will keep coming.
So, Ed, really interesting there. Again, in the president sort of positioning the United States as more than just an ally, but an equal and active partner in this fight.
Yeah, and at a time when we're struggling to get vaccinations into the arms of Americans, notable that they're putting up a total of $4 billion to help jumpstart a fund to make sure that the vaccine eventually gets into the arms of people around the world, especially in developing countries. They were asked about this last night, administration officials, in a call with reporters, and they, reminded that this country's struggling with it. Why should we be paying money to other countries to get their work done on vaccinations? And the argument essentially is, look, if you don't, it has adverse effects on the global economy. It could have adverse effects on American national security. If there are parts of the world where the pandemic is allowed to fester and continue to infect people, slow down those economies and potentially cause political disruptions as well. So this is a classic sort of soft power move by the United States that you would have seen in the past from a Bush administration, the Obama administration, maybe the Clinton administration, and you're certainly going to see it from the Biden administration. You're trying to tackle the issue at home domestically in an aggressive way, but you've also got to help out the rest of the world as a leader that is turned to in moments like this to try to help.
And Ed, that's something that President Biden mentioned in his talk as well. He said, this is a point, we're coming to a reckoning, there's an inflection point with authoritarianism versus democracy. And he said he hopes that democracy will win out, but that's a fundamental belief of this administration, that soft power that you were talking about. You can roll in with a bunch of troops, or you can roll up to a natural disaster or a pandemic with boxes with USAID stamped on the side of them. And there's two schools of thought, but the Biden administration believes that that kind of thing, that stepping into these voids and showing that America can be a partner to these countries, is not only good ethically, but it's good practically, because the places that we don't step in, we have seen China taking those places and saying, we'll deliver you masks, we'll deliver you PPE, hey, we can get vaccines to you. And if the U.S. doesn't do that, it's ceding that power and that position to China, which is a strategic competitor.
Yeah, you know, Christina, it's funny. As I was listening to the president talk, I thought both President Trump and President Biden used the phrase "step up," you know, and I thought it was so interesting the different ways in which they're using American money, essentially. That we saw with President Trump, him often say, "Well, I'll just take my money and go home. I'll just take my ball and go home." And what we're seeing with President Biden here is using the financial power that the U.S. has to lure and encourage other countries to follow suit, leading by example, essentially. I thought it was really interesting that he said, you know, that this is a time to prove that this model of democracy is not a relic of history. And I wonder just how much, when it came to the State Department, what happened on January 6th, when it comes to foreign policy, what happened on January 6th is sort of weighing heavy on the mind of the president and others that are now, you know, kind of participating in outreach again to the international community.
You know, I mean, look, Secretary Blinken said one of the biggest things that we have to do is, if we want to be a leader in the world, is get our own house in order. That's probably about as far as they've said. We've asked multiple questions about what diplomats around the world have said to their counterparts about what happened at the Capitol or what happened with this election. And it does make it harder. Diplomats have said it makes it harder for them in countries that clearly have rigged elections and clearly have authoritarian governments who, Burma's a good example, Myanmar. You know, we heard some of the same rhetoric coming out of their rigged election, you know, polling issues that we heard in our own presidential campaign. And it makes it harder for diplomats and for America to use, you know, to lead by example, right? To say, well, you can't do this. They're going to turn around and say, you had guys like knocking down the doors of your Capitol. Leave us alone. We're going to do our own thing. However, the theory here is that if you build back those democratic norms, if you do get your own house in order, that it makes it easier for the U.S. to advocate for those democratic principles abroad. And that's something that the administration says they're going to advocate for. Of course, we'll have to see. It's early on. We'll have to see how well they are actually able to do that when the rubber hits the road and all these international problems really start to flare.
Hey, Ed, Christina, it's always good to have you along to guide us through what all this stuff means. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.